In August of 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein believed he could get away with it because he was too valuable as a foreign policy asset for the United States to get rid of. And if that had been proven untrue, he saw the Soviet Union as his backup plan, presuming Moscow would instinctually support the opposite side of the US. But Saddam made a critical error. He chose the worst possible time to do it. The US still had its Cold War military budget, and the Soviet Union was disintegrating before everyone's eyes, with Gorbachev having a close relationship with President Bush. Within hours of the invasion, the US orchestrated a UN resolution condemning it, and within a week got approval from Saudi Arabia to deploy hundreds of thousands of American troops to the Gulf. Additional UN resolutions would economically isolate Iraq, while other countries would join the US in a coalition to liberate Kuwait. But of all of these developments, it was Gorbachev's cooperation with the US that made it so effective. The UN didn't have a very good track record of preventing wars or in getting much done at all due to the antagonism between the US and USSR. But this brief window of Russo-American rapprochement would allow the UN and international community to be more organized than at any point before. There were forces within Gorbachev's government, however, that wanted to save Saddam from himself. And so, Gorbachev would try to slow walk the international pressure every step of the way. Which is why Gorbachev and Bush would meet in Helsinki, Finland, to hopefully solidify their course. I want to work with you as equal partners in dealing with this. I want to go to the American people tomorrow night to close the book on the Cold War and offer them the vision of this new world order in which we will cooperate. The Soviets' long relationship with Saddam and Iraq was a holdover from their stance in the Arab-Israeli conflict, having sided with the Arabs supporting one or more regime as client states, starting with Egypt under Nasser, switching over to Syria after the Yom Kippur War, and then to Iraq in the 1980s. With their influence across the world collapsing, Soviet hardliners wanted to retain some semblance of influence to satiate their egos. Combine this with an economy in freefall and you can see the pressure Gorbachev was under, trying to appease both the hardliners and the reformers. Despite this, Gorbachev would go along with Bush's plans, even if he had to be dragged every step of the way. The White House, filled with veterans of the Nixon and Reagan administrations, wanted to avoid what they believed were the strategic and political mistakes of Vietnam and Beirut. The military mistakes were being accounted for by approving the use of overwhelming force to defend Saudi Arabia, but most officials in the White House and Pentagon were far more concerned with the political mistakes, viewing both Vietnam and Lebanon as failures of the administration to outline a clear goal and build domestic support. President Bush would address these concerns by making the moral case, emphasizing the inhumane nature of the invasion and of Saddam's regime.
These developments not only underscore the brutal behavior of Iraq, but also the international support that exists and is marshaled against Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. I've often said that it is not the United States against Iraq, but Iraq against the world. And for our part, we will continue to do everything possible to ensure that the sanctions work as intended and to deter, and if need be, defend Saudi Arabia against armed attack. And here I just want to reiterate what I said when I first ordered the U.S. forces to Saudi Arabia, namely that the United States forces were sent to Saudi Arabia at the request of the Saudi government, and those same U.S. forces will depart as soon as they are no longer needed or wanted, and they will remain not one day longer than is absolutely necessary.
General Norman Schwarzkopf, a veteran of the Vietnam War and the officer in charge of the Central Command, was organizing the war effort on the ground in Saudi Arabia, and he too was trying to avoid the political missteps of Vietnam. He would craft a set of rules for dealing with the press. Assert your expertise. You don't have to answer all of their questions. Don't answer a question if it would give up information that helps the enemy, but also don't lie. Think back to what caused the disenchantment of the American public with Vietnam. They felt they were constantly being misled with false body counts and optimistic talks about the light at the end of the tunnel. There would be times when my information would be incomplete. I had to resist the temptation to draw rosy conclusions and report them as fact. Saddam would help the coalition members maintain public support in their countries by taking their diplomatic staffs hostage, which the UN Security Council would condemn in Resolution 667. It's around this time that non-American forces started to arrive in Saudi Arabia. Now, given the context, it might be surprising, but the most war-happy powers were the Gulf states themselves, with Saudi troops being stationed on the front line. Gulf leaders would frequently ask the U.S. diplomats and military personnel to hurry up and attack the Iraqis already, making General Schwarzkopf fear triggering a premature fight. The biggest uncertainty was what Saddam would do next. Around the time Saddam started taking diplomats hostage, he had begun to pull his forces away from the Saudi border and replace Republican guards with soldiers from the regular army, having them build up defensive infrastructure. It was at this point that General Schwarzkopf was able to tell the administration that the likelihood of Saddam invading Saudi Arabia was slim, and that he was now hoping to solidify his gains in Kuwait. Despite no longer fearing another Iraqi offensive, Central Command still had to deal with the material needs of the deployment. They borrowed tents from the Saudis used to house pilgrims during the Hajj, as well as festival tents from Germany to shelter coalition troops. But none of this was free, and Central Command was struggling to pay the bills. Despite King Fahd promising to pay for Desert Shield, the day-to-day finances were handled by the Byzantine Saudi bureaucracy, and nearly every official feared approving any expenditures for fear of reprimand from their superiors. In the early weeks of the buildup, it would be Japan that paid for much of the costs, circumventing the Treasury and Congress by transferring funds directly to Central Command. And there were also disputes over what costs King Fahd had actually agreed to cover. The US interpreted his promise as covering all expenses, while the Saudis interpret it as only covering costs incurred from activities in the country, not including the costs of transporting men and material to the Gulf. And this dispute would continue for several months. But the Saudis weren't the only regional power that the coalition needed to deal with. The Egyptians had been aligned with the US since the mid-70s, and were already considered a traitor by much of the Arab world after the Camp David Accords. What the US feared were countries that could cause problems for the coalition. Iran, still reeling from its war with Iraq, was unlikely to interfere in the coalition's efforts. But Syria was another story. Syria and Iraq's relationship was complicated. Both were Ba'athist regimes, but each wanted to be the superior partner in any unified state, which is why Saddam removed his predecessor from power in 1979. When war between Iran and Iraq broke out, Saddam had hoped for Syria to at least support them politically, but Hafez al-Assad decided to prioritize its co-religionist ties with Iran over its pan-Arabist ties with Iraq. And Syria had been a thorn in the side of US policy for most of the 80s. Its intervention in Lebanese affairs, including its support for Palestinian terrorist groups, led to the Israeli invasion in 1982, which resulted in the US sending in the Marines, which Syrian-backed militants would attack and harass until they pulled out. But in the late 80s, there was a change. Various Lebanese and Palestinian terrorist groups and militias would kidnap Western hostages throughout the decade, and different countries had different ways of dealing with them. The US would end up selling arms to the Iranians to get them to force their proxies to release American hostages. But after this scheme, referred to as the Iran-Contra affair, was uncovered, the State Department and CIA would begin reaching out to Hafez al-Assad to serve as the middleman between themselves and the various hostage takers. Syria had been one of the boogeymen of the Reagan administration, having closely aligned themselves with the Soviets. But after Mikhail Gorbachev told Hafez al-Assad that the Soviet Union would no longer support military parity between them and Israel in 1987, Syria decided it needed to pivot toward friendlier relations with the US, and helping free American hostages from its own proxies was an easy first step. Assad not supporting Saddam also repaired the Arab world's perceptions of Syria after it had sided with the Iranians, as well as after fomenting civil war in Lebanon. And although this channel is not supported by the Assad regime, it is supported by its generous patrons, of which I would like to thank the newest ones who have joined since the last video. Angela, Victor, Emmanuel, Ross, Adam, JJ, Fernando, and Scavone. The support from my generous patrons allows me to spend more time working on these videos, especially when sponsorships aren't rolling in. And thanks to the generous support of patrons this year, I've finally been able to hit my first major Patreon milestone, which allows me to offer, for the first time, annual memberships to the Patreon. The annual memberships are discounted at 10%, so if you've been thinking about doing it, or have just wanted this particular occasion to happen, well, it's now an option. Patrons get access to a number of special perks, such as access to a patrons-only Discord server, as well as access to the fully footnoted scripts and the notes that I use to make these videos. They also get early access to ad-free versions of the videos. In addition to this, they also get to vote in special patrons-only polls, such as the one I have up on the Patreon right now to decide what topic I will make a video on when the Patreon eventually hits $500 a month. But I know most people who support a creator on Patreon do so because they like what the creator does. They think what they does has some value and want to see them make more and do it for longer. And so we creators offer these perks as just a way of saying thank you. And so to all the patrons who are currently on and in the future who join, thank you so much. But for now, let's get back to the history. But there's a difference between simply not supporting Saddam and actively opposing his efforts, which is what the US wanted from Hafez. Most moderate Arab states had supported the coalition, but this would be portrayed by Saddam as corrupt monarchs collaborating with imperialist infidels. What the coalition would need is one or more of the radical Arab states to join the coalition, and so Secretary Baker would meet with Assad to get that support. When you go to Damascus, you are doing something he wants very badly, and you won't get anything from him that he isn't already prepared to do. Baker arrived in Damascus on September 14th, emphasizing the need for Saddam to be thoroughly defeated, not just on the battlefield, but in the Arab psyche. Assad would give vague commitments, unwilling to put a number to the manpower he would send. Despite the coalition growing, the administration was still uncertain what direction it was going to take. Colin Powell supported giving the sanctions as much time to work as they could, but Bush and Scowcroft feared that they would take too long to be effective, or that they might not work at all. This became a bigger concern as the CIA was in agreement with the Israelis on Iraq either having or being on the verge of possessing a nuclear weapon, because the second they proved to have one, Saddam would be untouchable. Sanctions left the initiative with the Iraqis to decide when they had had enough, and history had taught us that sanctions take time, if they work at all. The campaign to build and maintain international support for the coalition continued throughout September, with a big UN meeting on the 30th. President Bush would meet with Margaret Thatcher, where they continued to disagree on whether a Security Council resolution was necessary to use force against Saddam. They also disagreed on the timing of an attack, with Thatcher believing they should attack whenever they felt they were ready, whereas Bush believed that they would need some kind of provocation. Bush also feared a prolonged air campaign, believing the international will for a ground attack would evaporate as Iraq's infrastructure was decimated. However, they were both in agreement that sanctions probably wouldn't work, and that force was the only language Saddam understood. At the summit, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and First Lady Barbara Bush would both get a chance to meet with Queen Noor of Jordan, the wife of King Hussein, who was supporting Iraq against the coalition's efforts. Mulroney would explain to her that the longer the crisis went on, the more likely the coalition would have to use force, while Barbara emphasized the consequences of such a war. Queen Noor would tell them about Saddam needing an off-ramp that would let him save face. Otherwise, he would meet the same fate of other Arab leaders when politically or militarily defeated. She also bemoaned the state of Jordan's economy. The kingdom was overburdened with its own refugee problem, most of whom were Palestinians who were strong supporters of Saddam. A country that is overburdened with problems and has come out on the wrong side of the Iraqi problem. They desperately need money for their refugees, and it is hard to raise. Although Saddam put much of his hopes in the Soviets tripping up the coalition, France was another potential roadblock. Similar to the Soviet Union, France had a history of selling weapons to Iraq as well as many of the components of its nuclear program, and France would rhetorically weaken the coalition when President Francois Mitterrand spoke to the UN General Assembly, and France would rhetorically weaken the coalition when President Francois Mitterrand spoke to the UN General Assembly and didn't call for the restoration of the Kuwaiti monarchy after Iraq withdrew. And while Iraq was hoping the Soviets or French would disrupt the coalition's momentum, President Bush feared the Israelis might do so with their own intervention. Since the late 70s, Iraq has been the biggest foreign policy concern of Israel, which resulted in the Israelis destroying the Osirak reactor in 1981, but their concerns didn't go away. Saddam would rebuild his nuclear program during the Iran-Iraq War, and the Israelis suspected that he might be on the verge of successfully building a bomb. They were also concerned with Iraq's manufacture of chemical weapons and their purchase of Soviet missile technology. Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Arens would meet with Defense Secretary Cheney to explain these concerns, which Cheney was sympathetic to. Arens believed that Saddam might try to turn the invasion of Kuwait into an Arab war against Israel, and if photos from US satellites could be provided to Israel so they could get a better glimpse at where the chemical plants and missile launchers were. But Cheney refused, fearing that Israel would use the intelligence to launch an attack on Iraq before the coalition's ground forces were ready to fight, all the while the administration still hadn't decided on its long-term course of action. The specter of the breakup of the coalition was continually held before us. The real objective of President Bush's policy was to cement an image that the United States was a friend of the Arab world. Israeli involvement might tarnish that image. With the possibilities of chemical or biological warfare as real legitimate threats, the Israeli government began a campaign to procure gas masks. But in order to prevent public panic, they decided to do this covertly. But when this campaign leaked, the Shamir government was forced to scour Europe for more gas masks and slowly distribute them. Initially, they didn't distribute gas masks to the residents of the West Bank or Gaza, under the presumption that Saddam wouldn't target fellow Arabs. However, Israeli settlers in the West Bank, along with Arabs in Bethlehem, filed a class action lawsuit demanding equal protection as those living in Israel proper, and the Israeli Supreme Court would eventually order the government to provide gas masks to the residents of the West Bank and Gaza. The issue was exacerbated by a violent incident when an Orthodox Jewish group laid a cornerstone for what they hoped would become the Third Temple on October 8th. This sparked a riot when Palestinians on the Temple Mount began throwing stones at Jews worshipping at the Western Wall. The Israeli border police, who were the nearest security forces present, fired on the stone throwers, killing 17 Palestinians. This incident led to Saddam again publicly tying his withdrawal from Kuwait to Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. Arab Security Council members drafted a condemnation of Israel, which led to the US and the UK drafting their own condemnation, but in less harsh terms, in order to not only, not anger the Israelis out of fear of them attacking Saddam, but also hopefully enough to appease the Arabs and keep them in the coalition. In early October, General Schwarzkopf was asked to present his preliminary plans for Desert Storm, despite him insisting it wasn't ready. The plan had 4 phases: airstrikes to destroy strategic infrastructure, supply stores, and the Republican Guard, followed by a head-on ground assault into Kuwait. The Joint Chiefs didn't like the 4th phase, which to some felt like a suicide mission. The Deputy National Security Advisor, Robert Gates, accused Schwarzkopf of intentionally presenting them with a terrible plan in order to dissuade the administration from a ground assault. My God, he's already got all the forces he needs. Why won't he attack? Schwarzkopf is just another McClellan. When Powell mentioned the McClellan comment, Schwarzkopf yelled, "You tell me what son of a bitch said that. I'll show him the difference between Schwarzkopf and McClellan." According to Schwarzkopf, Gates had been watching Ken Burns' The Civil War on PBS, and suddenly felt like he was an expert in military strategy. Now, Powell had prefaced the presentation that Schwarzkopf wasn't satisfied with the plan as it was, and that it was designed to utilize the 200,000 soldiers presently in Saudi Arabia, rather than the 400,000 to 500,000 he preferred. However, Cheney and the Joint Chiefs felt that the plan didn't fully utilize the resources already available. He would give this operation to his Undersecretary Paul Wolfowitz to draft other options. A couple weeks later, Cheney would present his team's offensive plan, which involved deploying paratroopers to western Iraq to meet up with helicopter and tank brigades to take out missile launch sites, and then head east toward Baghdad. But this wasn't Cheney's only idea. He also asked Powell to explore nuclear options, which was given to a small team whose report said that it would take a considerable number of tactical nukes to make a difference on the battlefield. Powell showed the report to Secretary Cheney one time and then destroyed it. If I had any doubts before about the practicality of nukes on the field of battle, this report clinched them. Cheney would claim that he was just trying to get Schwarzkopf and Powell to think a little more creatively, but you never know with some of these guys. Up to this point, the president and NSC hadn't given Schwarzkopf the green light to plan an offensive based on what he believed would be necessary, rather than what had been made available. This was partly because the US hadn't received permission from the Saudis to station more than 200,000 troops yet. But more importantly, President Bush was still vacillating on whether he was willing to risk American lives in the name of Kuwait and international law. At the same time, however, he was also getting impatient for an excuse to attack Saddam. Had the Iraqis shot at coalition forces, they wouldn't need a UN resolution to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait or even to chase the Republican Guard back to Baghdad. The first of these concerns would be addressed by Central Command and the State Department. Not only did they need permission to station more troops in the country, but they also needed explicit permission to launch an offensive into Kuwait from Saudi territory. Schwarzkopf feared that popular support for Saddam in the Arab streets would deter Arab governments from granting permission for the attacks. James Baker would visit Saudi Arabia in late October, where he got reassurances from King Fahd that Saudi troops would stay the course if Saddam dragged Israel into the fight, along with agreeing to allow more US troops. It was at this point, most observers believe, Bush had made his decision. President Bush came to the conclusion, consciously or unconsciously, that he had to do whatever was necessary to liberate Kuwait, and the reality was that meant using force. He seemed no longer wrestling with the issue of sending American boys to be killed, that awful decision that only a president can make. Around the time of Baker's meeting with King Fahd, Colin Powell would visit Schwarzkopf in Saudi Arabia, where he gave him the news that the administration would now be giving him any and all resources he needed to succeed. If we go to war, we will not do it halfway. The United States military will give you whatever you need to do it right. We had learned a lesson in Panama. Go in big and end it quickly. We could not put the United States through another Vietnam. Powell's guarantee was a tad premature, but a week later, a meeting at the White House would approve the deployment of more troops and the drafting of offensive plans. The planned troop buildup would be announced after midterms, where the president had tried to keep the Gulf crisis a nonpartisan issue. General Schwarzkopf would go into full planning mode after receiving formal confirmation from Powell about the president's decision. His new battle plan had 5 goals: decapitate the leadership and command structure of Iraqi forces, establish air superiority, cut Iraqi supply lines, destroy chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons capability, and destroy the Republican Guard. I want you to destroy the Republican Guard. When you're done with them, I don't want them to be an effective fighting force anymore. I don't want them to exist as a military organization. We're not going into this with one arm tied behind our backs. We're not going to say we want to be as nice as we possibly can. And if they draw back across the border, that's fine with us. That's bullshit. We're going to destroy the Republican Guard. I wanted to make absolutely sure that if we took on Saddam, we would win not only on the battlefield, but in the history books, and that included Arab history books. Based on his equipment and personnel demands, Schwarzkopf estimated that the earliest he could be ready for a ground operation was early February. With the decision to expel Saddam by force made, the administration could now focus on building political support for the war. Of course, this was underway before the decision to invade was made. In mid-October, Cheney visited both London and Moscow to meet with Thatcher and Gorbachev. The former gave him advice on military strategy and maintaining public support based on her experience during the Falklands War. The latter gave him intelligence on specs of the weapons they had sold to Saddam. The trip also allowed Cheney to visit Soviet factories, whose manufacturing capacity, he noted, had drastically diminished. He would also prep the public for the possibility of war during TV interviews, saying that although it wasn't a foregone conclusion, it was very possible. President Bush and Prime Minister Thatcher continued their debate over whether to seek additional authorization from the UN. The Iraqis are clearly trying to avoid a provocation. My own view is increasingly that once we have the necessary forces in place, we should go sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we risk losing the support of Arab governments who will not understand delay and come to question our resolve. We shall also be confronted with further peace proposals, further incidents in the occupied territories, and growing strain on the coalition against Iraq. Saddam Hussein has got to lose and be seen to lose. We don't need more causes. Our embassies are there to protect our people. If we leave, aren't we deserting our people? But we need no more triggers for military action, and if you send helicopters in, they could be shot down. They are sitting ducks. Our embassy must close anyway. We can't service our people inside. We are ready for the air campaign. We don't have unlimited time. This appeals to us to act on a moral basis and to act together. Bush's primary concern was maintaining public support. By 1990, the general consensus on the American right was that Vietnam was a political defeat and not a military one. You could win every engagement on the battlefield, but if the voting public grows tired of the war, they will vote people into power who promise to end it. This is what the debates within the administration, as well as amongst coalition leaders, were about. Going to war with insufficient force could lead to a quagmire which could drag on the fighting and thus lead to losing public support. And so waiting until you have all of your ducks in a row and have the materials you need to actually win the fight quickly was essential. However, the longer it takes for you to get your ducks in a row also gives your enemy the possibility of getting their shit together as well, which could also prolong the fight and thus sap public will. And then there's the whole issue of how the fighting actually starts. If you attack the enemy without provocation, then the public is going to be less supportive of your actions. However, if you wait until provocation happens, then again, you give the enemy time to prepare, and when fighting eventually starts, it could take longer as well. President Bush wanted to maintain high public morale for the upcoming war, not just for the sake of this conflict, but for the sake of future conflicts. The public gets war weary, there might not be enough political support to engage in future fights when needed. There was also the problem of political expediency. Seeking UN authorization would certainly provide political cover for the US and other coalition members. I mean, you're not fighting for your own sake, you're fighting for the sake of international law and order. But this also creates future public expectations. I mean, you got support for the last war, why didn't you get international support for this war? And there are innumerable reasons as to why this might be the case. And here we see the biggest difference between the US and UK. President Bush was concerned with maintaining public support, while Thatcher was concerned with setting public expectations. President Bush, as the leader of the coalition, had to balance all of these concerns and interests, and would ultimately side with public and political support over expectations and prerogatives. and thus President Bush would order Secretary of State James Baker to begin lobbying the governments of the Security Council members to support a resolution, and time the vote for when the U.S. held the rotating presidency of the Council. And the most frustrating member to deal with would be the Soviet Union, who was desperate to retain any semblance of superpower parity with the U.S. The Soviets were still holding up Yevgeny Primakov as the ideal man to negotiate with Saddam, but when he visited Baghdad in late October, Hussein threatened to attack Saudi oil fields if any attacks were launched at him. He also tried to tie his withdrawal from Kuwait to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict again, knowing the Soviets would be sympathetic to the case. Primakov would meet with both Bush and Thatcher after his meeting in Baghdad. He would tell President Bush about Saddam's demeanor, and how Hussein claimed that he would rather die than leave Kuwait. Primakov believed that Saddam's advisors were misleading him about the international situation, due to Saddam believing that most of the world had supported him, and that they were encouraging him to drag the Israelis into the conflict. However, at least according to Primakov, Saddam seemed to be aware that he had bitten off more than he could chew. "I'd die before leaving. I'm prepared to die, but this battle is not confined to one country alone. I am a realist. I know I must leave Kuwait, but I simply can't leave." Some of the sources I read for this video said that Saddam trying to tie his withdrawal from Kuwait to an Israeli withdrawal from the Palestinian territories was evidence that he was looking for a way out, but I'm not convinced. Saddam was a conspiracist and believed that the CIA and Mossad were all-knowing and all-powerful. He was also a raging anti-Semite who believed every stereotype about the Jews and believed Israel and the US were willing to use nuclear weapons on Iraq. Believing all these things about the Israelis would lead you to suspect that if this offer was sincerely made to the Israelis, that they probably would have rejected it. And if Saddam was making an offer to the Israelis that he knew they would reject, it kind of sounds like he probably wasn't serious about it. Instead, he was looking for an international justification for his occupation, letting him blame Israel for the invasion, which is consistent with his rhetoric about the Kuwaiti government. It seems most likely that this, as well as most of his other ploys, were all about buying time, dragging the process out long enough in the hopes that the West would lose interest. With this reality in mind, President Bush would send Secretary Baker out to secure the coalition's resolve, such as agreeing to reduce troop levels in the Gulf if Saddam voluntarily withdrew from Kuwait, as well as creating a claims tribunal at The Hague to resolve the border dispute between Iraq and Kuwait. Vice President Dan Quayle would also be enlisted to meet with coalition partners, with the French becoming a particular annoyance for him. The French couldn't seem to make up their minds. They were hoping they wouldn't have to participate, but if there was any action, they wanted to be a part of it. Similar to Middle Eastern leaders, Mitterrand was also upset with the US for having pulled out of Lebanon, due to France having been a major partner in the multinational force sent in during the Battle of Beirut. On top of that, the French public didn't support their government trying to restore the Kuwaiti monarchy and didn't like defending the House of Saud. I went to Saudi Arabia recently. In their palaces, one sees no women or ordinary people. It's not the kind of government I would like to send French soldiers to be killed for. A country could not commit itself to the principles of Kuwait. They cannot ask soldiers to die for the way the Kuwaitis have their type of government. How am I going to tell French farmers I've committed their sons' lives to retain a billionaire? Can we ensure the use of force is not just protecting the safety of banks in Switzerland? It's an idea that leaves me totally cold. The French weren't the only ones having trouble with the cultural and political realities of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's draconian social codes and morality police would rub U.S. forces the wrong way. The U.S. military had to ban alcohol and pornography on U.S. bases, as well as forbid mixed-sex gatherings off base. And the authorities received complaints about female soldiers removing their fatigues in public. At this early stage, morale among our troops was high, but the desert was a bleak, forbidding world, hedged in by Muslim moral strictures uncongenial to GIs from the Western world. And it wasn't just secular Western debauchery that got American commanders in hot water with Saudi officials. It was also just basic religious practices. So in the US, there are a number of religious nonprofits whose sole purpose is basically acquiring Bibles to give to soldiers who are enlisted. And you can consider in this conflict, when you have US soldiers stationed far away from home in a majority Muslim country, you can imagine that they were especially interested in getting these Bibles into the soldiers' hands. And this was a double problem for Saudi Arabia because, A, the importation of Bibles was illegal in Saudi Arabia, and this was the case because apostasy, as in converting from Islam to any other religion, is illegal and is punishable by death. Well, some of these religious nonprofits were also hoping to engage in a bit of covert missionary work in Saudi Arabia during the conflict. And so they would have to arrange a means of basically importing the Bibles into Saudi Arabia by skipping the ports and just flying them directly to U.S. military bases. The Arabs will take your sons, but not their Bibles? Colin, be reasonable. It will be reported on CNN. What will our people think? And so, although the Bible issue was eventually resolved, there was also the issue of chaplains being asked to not wear any kind of open signs of their non-Muslim religion in public, as well as worship services for non-Muslims not being allowed to be either recorded or publicized in any way. We all want the troops to have freedom of worship, but to do that we have to use a little judgment. You chaplains who are assigned to Riyadh and other cities already know how sensitive the local people are. The very sight of a cross is offensive to them. I'm asking those of you in the cities to take the Christian or Jewish insignia off your uniforms, or to wear them in such a way that they can't be seen. And the restrictions on Jewish soldiers were even harsher, with Jewish soldiers not even allowed to pray or hold worship services on Saudi soil, thus forcing the US to have to helicopter Jewish enlistees onto a nearby US ship in the Gulf to hold any kind of worship service. They can die defending your country, but they can't pray in it? And the more conservative elements of Saudi society would actively try to break up the relationship between the US military and Saudi Arabia. There was an incident where some bazaars in the cities were selling shirts that showed like a tank on top of a map of Saudi Arabia. And the kicker here is that the reason people are getting in trouble is because this map of Saudi Arabia on shirts showed the locations of Mecca and Medina, which can be found in any atlas around the world, but in Saudi Arabia at the time was apparently considered classified information, even though everyone knew exactly where they were. But the fact that they're considered classified information was also the justification for why atlases were banned in Saudi Arabia at the time. And Saudi officials initially blamed Americans for selling the shirts, but as it turns out, no, it wasn't them. It was Pakistani expats trying to sell these shirts to Americans. And so, as it turns out, some of the conservative political forces in Saudi Arabia had lied to the Saudi officials in order to try and get them to kick the American military out. But a more active part of the resistance to the American presence would be 33-year-old Osama Bin Laden. Bin Laden had spent much of the 80s helping funnel money and arms to various Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets, after which he began aiding jihadists in Yemen. Osama bin Laden allegedly sent a letter to King Fahd offering to recruit a ragtag team of Muslim fighters to resist an Iraqi invasion in place of US and coalition forces. The closest he got, according to his own testimony, were a couple deputy ministers. I directed my advice straight to the Deputy Minister of Defense, informing him of the great sins from which the state should desist, and of the danger of persisting with them, but to no avail. Then I met the Deputy Director of the Ministry for Security Affairs, who strongly reproached me for advising the Deputy Minister of Defense and began haranguing me about exactly the same sins that I mentioned to the minister. And when these direct appeals didn't work, Osama bin Laden began fear-mongering to local religious leaders, telling them about how the secular Westerners were going to corrupt the moral Saudi society, which Saddam had actually been making these same points to foreign religious leaders as well. Back in London, Thatcher's government was drawing up their own list of policy goals, more or less in line with the US, but with an extra emphasis on the destruction of Iraqi WMDs and the creation of a regional security alliance against Iraq. But like the US government, she was also politically preparing the British public for war. There is never any lack of people anxious to avoid the use of force, no matter how little chance there is of negotiation succeeding, and no matter how many difficulties are created for the troops who are trying to prepare themselves for war, the case is always made for yet another piece of last-ditch diplomacy. By early November, the Bush administration had decided to seek a UN resolution authorizing force to expel Saddam after Baker's meeting with coalition leaders. And although he was committed to using arms, President Bush feared setting a specific deadline for withdrawal. Doing so publicly would not only commit the coalition to military action and give Saddam a chance to bolster his forces, but also make it more likely Saddam might agree to some peaceful solution that would let him preserve his military strength, leaving him able to threaten his neighbors again. And although they had sufficient air power to achieve the destruction of strategic Iraqi infrastructure, their ground forces wouldn't be ready until February. And when the president asked the NSC what they should do if Iraq attacked Israel before their full force arrived, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft suggested they attack Kuwait early. The Soviets continued to slow-walk the coalition's efforts. The Bush administration wanted to pass a Security Council resolution that demanded Iraq withdraw from Kuwait by a certain date, and if it didn't, the coalition was given the authority to expel them by force. Gorbachev tried to get Bush to split the resolution in two, first passing the deadline resolution and then passing the authorization of force, but Bush believed that it would take too long to pass the second resolution and give Saddam the opportunity to stall the process. The Soviets weren't the only hesitant coalition partners. Aside from France, Chancellor Helmut Kohl was also worried that a war in the Middle East might harm him in the federal elections in December, the first held since formal reunification in October that year. But Thatcher was also dealing with political problems at home, with an internal challenge to her leadership of the Conservative Party, and despite this, she was still in full support of the war. Another potential wrinkle was China, who along with the Soviets had a history of shenanigans in the UN. The Chinese were apprehensive about supporting military actions, believing it would alter the balance of power in the Gulf. When China's foreign minister, Chiang Kai-shek, told this to James Baker while in Cairo, Baker retorted that the balance of power had already been altered by Saddam. Neither President Bush nor Secretary Baker had visited China since the administration was sworn in, which Beijing had been requesting. But there was still substantial political pressure at home for the administration to distance itself from China after the Tiananmen Square massacre. In exchange for a visit from Baker in 1991, Kai-shek offered to not veto the Security Council resolution. After his visit to Egypt, Baker would meet with Al-Zal in Turkey, and then with Eduard Shevardnadze in Moscow. The Soviets had been hoping to let sanctions work, but Baker explains to them that the sanctions weren't going to. Tightening the sanctions isn't the problem. This guy will let everybody in the country starve before he'll give this up. The only thing that's critical then is that you're going to use force. You have to know that you will succeed. We learned from Afghanistan, don't listen to the military men who give you these simplistic views that you will succeed. You need to know that you'll succeed. Are you really sure you've thought this through? You understand now that if we pass a resolution authorizing the use of force, and if Saddam does not move, you will actually have to use force. If you do it, you have to use it. Are you really ready to do that right now? Baker's tour of coalition and Security Council countries continued with meeting the Canadian Foreign Minister in Bermuda, followed by meetings in Geneva with the foreign ministers of the Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, and Zaire, who all supported the proposed resolution. As the possibility of direct clashes with the coalition grew, Saddam would try to break up the alliance by releasing hostages from key countries, in hopes that they could scuttle the resolution vote at the UN. World leaders gathered in France for the signing of the Paris Charter, which gave coalition leaders a chance to discuss further plans for the Gulf. One standout moment made in light of recent events was the speech by President Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia has made it clear on a number of occasions that it is necessary to resist evil, that it is necessary to resist aggression, because our own history has taught us ample lessons about the consequences of appeasement. After the Paris summit, James Baker would visit Yemen, whose UN ambassador was trying to get a resolution passed calling for UN monitors to be placed in the West Bank and Gaza. The US was already pressuring Israel to stay out of the conflict with Iraq, and thus would have to veto the resolution if put to a vote. But Baker feared doing so would anger the Arab members of the coalition and threatened to fracture it, so he began to pressure President Saleh. Baker pointed out that the US hadn't placed the newly unified Yemen on its state sponsor of terror list, despite South Yemen having been on it, in addition to the $70 million in annual foreign aid. Despite this, Saleh publicly said Yemen would vote no on the upcoming Security Council resolution. Baker would then meet with Abu Hassan, the foreign minister of Malaysia, at the Los Angeles International Airport. He was not happy having to take a 30-hour flight just because Baker wanted to avoid having to visit China. He would repeat some of Saddam's propaganda, asserting that the Israelis were the real criminals and that they should be prioritized over any actions against Saddam, and thus refused to make any commitments about his vote. In a meeting at the Paris summit, Gorbachev told Bush that he would vote in favor of the force authorization resolution, but that he couldn't announce so publicly prior to it. The USSR still had a large Muslim population who were very supportive of Saddam, and saw the Gulf crisis as the Western world ganging up on a Muslim country. But while world leaders were discussing the future of Europe and the Middle East, there was diplomatic subterfuge afoot. On November 19th, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney received a letter from former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, lobbying him to vote against the Bush administration's Security Council resolution. Jimmy Carter had sent letters to the ambassadors of all UN Security Council members except the U.S. hoping to persuade them to vote against the resolution authorizing force to expel Saddam. It was an unbelievable letter, asking the other members of the council to vote against his own country. Carter later acknowledged that he had sent the letter, but he claimed that he had told President Bush what he was doing. It seemed to me that if there was ever a violation of the Logan Act prohibiting diplomacy by private citizens, this was it. President Bush was furious. Although he was never punished for this, it's very likely that Jimmy Carter was, in fact, in violation of the Logan Act, which is a law forbidding unauthorized American citizens from negotiating with foreign governments. What's funny is that this wouldn't even be the last time Jimmy Carter violated the Logan Act, doing so again in 2008 when he opened up negotiations with Hezbollah against the explicit requests of the Bush administration. And so if I had a nickel for every time Jimmy Carter violated the Logan Act, I would have 2 nickels.
Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
The day before the resolution vote, Baker would secretly meet with the foreign minister of Cuba at the Waldorf Astoria, who had favored letting sanctions play out, and told him Cuba would vote no. And in one last meeting with the Chinese foreign minister, Chiang couldn't promise more than an abstention. Totalitarian regimes never seem to think that their internal policies, no matter how repressive, should be of any consequence in bilateral relations. The vote was held on November 29th. The debate saw Muslim-majority countries emphasize the need for more diplomacy in the period before any deadline. In the process of securing support of the Soviets and the cooperation of China, the resolution didn't explicitly call for armed force, but rather approved all means necessary, which provided Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping the political fig leaf they needed. It did not matter. A bullet fired through a euphemism is still a bullet. The final draft of the resolution gave Saddam until January 15, 1991, to pull his forces out of Kuwait. Otherwise, the coalition was given the authority to use all means necessary to expel them. The final vote saw 12 voting in favor, with both Cuba and Yemen voting against and China abstaining. The countdown to Desert Storm had begun.